I met some of you, and I will meet the others, but in any case, it's a pleasure for me to interact with the Med2IAH. It's much more difficult in English than it is in Slovenian, where we just Med2IAH. Because it's an important project for Emuni. I'm part of the Emuni team. It's an important project for Emuni, both in the theme that it tackles, internationalization, and I'm so used to this that I forgot to take it off, and also in the scope of countries and institutions that it covers. So my role at Emuni is, in part, I'm the head of academic affairs, which means that I take care of research activity. I develop and maintain strategic relations with institutions that are particularly important to Emuni. And my role is also then in managing things that are related to research, which I will speak about in the next minutes. And then for the rest, I'm also a researcher in the area of environmental governance. So in part I'm a researcher, in part I'm more of a manager. And so I thought what could be my good contribution to the project, of course, in close cooperation with the coordinator, Nada, we came to, my proposal was that I speak about internationalization in research activities of universities as quite a general topic. And in particularly, I wanted to reflect with you on really the scope and purpose of internationalization in science and research. Just probably taking us a step backwards, or rather than speaking about what is it that we do, reflect as a general rule, why is it that we cooperate in research and science internationally, cross-border, but also subnationally, different entities. And then very briefly, I'll speak about the EU approach to internationalization in science and research, and I think that will complement really nicely with probably what's coming up after me. And not to deviate from the fact that we at Emuni also do some research, I will also outline the role of internationalization in research at Emuni. And I think this will be enough for the time that was allocated to me. Before we proceed, and I think this will be a nice break for you all. Okay, and the first question asks you what's the share of Europeans that never left their country. Actually, most of you were right, which was the answer is 37%, and most of you were right. And then the next question is about which scientist never left her country. I provided some clues in the brackets as to what they did. I believe you will know all of them, perhaps not the Moroccan sociologist and feminist, Fatima Mernissi. Yeah, and also here, no, actually, that's surprising. Some of you think that Marie Curie Sklodowska, who's a Polish-French, never left her country. In fact, she did. And she moved around quite a lot. And the right answer really is just, I don't know, because all of them moved and quite heavily, which is fine. It's to show that all thinkers, regardless of the century in which they worked, had to move, or not had to, but they did move. Next question, in 2017, the share of articles in Nature Index, which were internationally collaborative, was. That's based on a study that was performed. It's now quite old, but I think the trends haven't moved significantly since. So in 2017, yeah, most of you got the answer of 60%, which is the right answer. So it's not as high as 100% or 90%, but it's not very low. It's, in fact, over half of all publications are co-authored internationally. Next, I think this one might be a bit difficult. It's actually asking you by how much has it increased? The share of international or internationally co-authored papers. It did increase by tenfold globally, but for some countries, and these are the so-called BRIC countries, it actually increased by 20-fold. So those countries that really advanced significantly in the past 20 years, when I say significant advanced in economic terms, they advanced also in international collaborations. And so China, Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, also upcoming countries, they really, their international collaborations increased by 20-fold. And the last question, do internationally co-authored papers get cited more often? Yes or no? Sure, they do get cited more often for a very logical reason. But there is an interesting aftermath to this question, is that internationally co-authored papers are not necessarily more innovative. When they were, so basically the research that did look at these papers looked also at how groundbreaking the concept in international research was. And they tend to go, so that's the claim, that they tend to go with more sort of, they just accumulate knowledge and synthesize it rather than make any breakthrough concepts. But that's not part of what, that's just another story. Okay, anyway, it was all a little bit for fun, but a little bit also to show you that international and science go really very much hand in hand. For us and for you probably at universities, anyone that's dealing with science, and that's natural, social sciences, behavioral science, and so on, we really think of science as we have been thinking about it as inherently international. And why is this so, or how does it, where did it start? Sorry, Alish, I'm unable to move. Can you help me? I just clicked then on that mouse. Yeah, so not undisturbed. Thanks. This is really part and parcel of the so-called globalization, which is an intensification of relationships and cultural and economic exchanges since the 1970s. So as soon as we were, as soon as the technology enabled us to have better connections, internet connections and transport connections, and of course have these exchanges more swiftly, science benefited from it immensely. But actually the idea of international science or ideas circulating around is as old as science in itself, or as old as knowledge in itself. Even the earliest philosophers and thinkers and scientists in the early centuries, there was always this, if you read the stories, there's always an idea of the text needs to be circulated. They went abroad. There were, just as there were pilgrimages, there were also travels for scientific purposes. And when universities were established around the 13th centuries, the first ones, this knowledge came together. So there were exchanges taking place at these institutions called universities. Then at the end of 19th century, when the instrument of sabbatical was introduced, there was a birth of international research universities where people got together for some time just to do research, and they also came from different countries. And of course, congresses really accelerated this. So the idea of mobility is inherent in knowledge in itself, which is of course universal. So much so that researcher of international scientific collaborations, Caroline Wagner, speaks of contemporary science as the new invisible college. And the thesis there is that we continue to have this very nationally rooted institutions, such as what have you. I'm sure all of your countries have like a research center. This would be, I think someone is from Lebanon, CNRS. We have CNRS in France, we have CNR in Lebanon. Then we have very nationally, even in the name, there's typically American Society for so-and-so songs, but in fact, the research that takes place in these institutions is inherently international, and a lot of researchers are located in some global, what we call epistemological communities, and they cooperate with their colleagues from across the world. And so while we tend to think of these institutions, they're actually the research produced there is much more global. Oops, apologies. I shouldn't put this all, yeah. So what did you do? You just press? Right, so I wanted to speak and think about what are the outputs of this internationalization processes. So just if I click this will be it. Yeah. Oh, I'll just move this one, yeah. So we see that in epistemological communities and networks. We also see the results of it in multinational composition of groups. And we mostly see it and we mostly measure it by co-authored publications, which is also something I asked you about in the quiz, just simply because it's easiest to measure. But of course, policies are following as well. So when we speak of what kind of policies are there to support internationalization, we see that the predominant one is the instrument of mobility. A lot of, even just briefly, money goes into allowing people to move. So much so that in Europe, we complain, and I say complain with a bit of sarcasm, we complain about the amount of funding that's available for us to move, to visit somebody, so on. It's much more difficult to get money to actually do research. But I guess this is a manifestation of how important it is for countries that are funding this research for you to go around and strike new cooperation. And of course, then another policy, another instrument that that also demonstrates the importance of internationalization is just putting different envelopes of different countries together and supporting large research centers and major scientific infrastructure. And we always use this example, but there really isn't any better example than Sesame, the synchrotron light for mental and applied sciences, which is located in Jordan. And I myself haven't been there, but it's an incredibly reputable and very much mentioned, often cited example of international effort to build this very expensive infrastructure, which allows then people to come together and do research regardless of where they're from and regardless of who paid for it, because it's also been open to scientists from the region, and it got the blessing from UNESCO. And the reason we mention Sesame so much is also in the context of science diplomacy, which I will get to a little bit later, but it's really an example that I think we should all be aware of, that we have some kind of collaborative large project in the region. This internationalization doesn't come without challenges. The first of them is, of course, linguistic diversity. When English has become lingua franca of publications, it's very difficult, and often also it's very difficult to retain the same language, the same level of language recognition of other languages, which is foremost a problem for smaller countries. And I believe a lot of countries in the regions are small, where actually the language, the issue is not only that we don't get to speak of it so much, but that terminology is not being developed. And that's something I see myself, that with doing readings and talking to your colleagues, you're actually not really contributing to professional vocabulary of your language. So terminology does get lost. And that is, I think, something we should speak about quite openly. But an interesting implication of this internationalization is also that that methodological diversity is getting lost a little bit, that certain methodologies prevail because they are much more conducive to international collaborations. And to not delve in on this issue for too long, for instance, case studies tend to get very much sidelined. It's much easier to do some kind of bibliographic research or some kind of quantitative research, whereas I'm not going to be simplifying it too much, but some certain methodologies are definitely not as prominent in this in the invisible college. And certain subjects and themes get neglected as well. Likewise, certain types of knowledge get neglected. In coming from social sciences myself, we have made, I believe, as social scientists, incredible efforts to put back on the map of what knowledge is, the knowledge that belongs to local communities and indigenous groups, because the push for internationalization was so strong and for so long that all that counted was really just science and predominantly this international science. And now we are seeing that, in particularly in relation to environment and the management of environment, we should be acknowledging and taking very seriously knowledge that comes from local communities and indigenous groups. And another interesting implication is also that not all disciplines are equally internationalized. And here I just presented findings from research that's quite old by now, but my guess is that hasn't changed much. Please don't take me, don't cite this here because there is 20 years of difference. But physics and mathematics are by far, they're a few 10% percentage point above biomedical sciences. Physics and mathematics, biomedical sciences follow, and engineering is already lagging behind, and then social sciences and humanities are much less internationalized disciplines. Okay, so I wanted to be also quite frank about challenges we have and about, I guess, just being aware of these challenges. We can do something about them if we're involved in research. There's a concept I wanted to introduce to you, or just recall if you know it, in the context of speaking about internationalization in science, and that's science diplomacy, and which is a term that's been spoken of and it's circulated around for quite long, but it's really been put on the map in 2010 by a report titled New Frontiers in Science Diplomacy, Navigating the Changing Balance of Powers, that was produced by the UK Royal Society and the American Association for Advancement of Science. And they wanted to categorize all kind of interplay between science and foreign affairs. And they coined these three categories of science in diplomacy, diplomacy for science, and science for and you can see now that you can get, you're probably guessing what these are about. Science in diplomacy is simply using sound science in your decision making, which relates to international decision making, as diplomacy is inherently international. Diplomacy for science relates to the deployment of diplomatic channels to enhance research capacities and quality of research. And science for diplomacy, to the contrary, is the use of science and cooperation between scientists in order to promote international understanding, peace, and prosperity. I guess this latest category is the one that's most curious also to us that form part of this community of universities, because suddenly there was an expectation that that scientists can also build bridges, so much so that they can be an element in building of the peace in certain countries. And this is a concept that has been present very much in the region. the EU commissioner, previous commissioner for science, Moedas, launched this term and really made it a flagship project of its mandate. But again, this is not hasn't been without critiques, and I wanted to spell these critiques out. Basically, they all relate to the fact of whether the question and dilemma about whether science and foreign politics can interrelate in such a way as to fulfill these ambitious expectations. First of all, it's quite difficult to think how really genuine cooperation in science can be engineered. We can ask people to mingle, but we can't force them to produce excellent science and least science that will have an impact on international relations. So the question of whether science is capable of overcoming political tensions is, I think, a very real one, and it's not proving, science is not proving quite of that, having quite that force. There's a difference between improved intercultural understanding among scientists, okay, from different people joining and learning about each other's culture, but it's a quite different thing from having these scientists really impact the relationships between countries. And of course, in this discourse about science diplomacy, science is romanticized and idealized quite often. We should be aware that science is not only collaborative. In fact, with increased significance placed on innovation, countries have become quite competitive about science and patents and all the implications that come out of these collaborations. So they're not thinking about science only in collaborative and win-win situation games. Quite often there is quite a heavy competition going on. And of course, the world's grand challenges are often politics is implicated there, apart from the fact that these are really complex challenges that we're facing, from demography to all kinds of pollution, climate change, of course, changes of supply chains and so on. And often science, can't be solving and can't be thought of as the single silver bullet that will solve these issues. And yes, in this thinking of science diplomacy, science can sometimes be used as a political tool when it shouldn't be, because it's quite free from it in the very idea of it. Okay, so this is something that I think has been evident from the discussion and the quiz that we had, that pursuing excellent science has always led to international activities, but also people's attitudes are increasingly more open to international cooperation. And another thing that is important, that I have dedicated a little bit of research in some years ago, is that there's also greater policy coherence. So when we have foreign policy is increasingly looking at what it can do, and it's engaging scientists in it, which is a bit controversial, but also science policy is trying to expand, not least for funds, and these two policies are coming together. And just two really sentences on this research that I did in this area is that by looking at how scientific operations did work over since the launch of the Barcelona process in 1996, which was a process that was trying to bring the region closer together, also through soft means, including education and science and research and intercultural exchanges. Research has always been one of the tools in the toolbox of this international understanding. But my conclusion from looking at the documents and also political relations was that strong cooperation in science was a product of friendly relations in the region, rather than a tool that was able to overcome difficult situations, which we don't have a shortage of in the region. So when Libya was basically isolated, there was no way of scientists, and in fact, they were very much engaged in different international networks to have any kind of breakthrough on the political front. So that's just to put, I guess, science also in its position, to be aware of how far it can go. And the EU's enthusiasm for science diplomacy, which is kind of really melting away now, it's not as strong as it used to be, as I said, in the previous mandate of the commissioner or the previous commission. So this enthusiasm can be related to the EU's internal policies goals. The EU was trying to project itself as an actor rather than any significant change in the policy tools. What that says is that we've had mobility forever and we will continue to have it. And when we started to speak of mobility as science diplomacy, nothing has really changed. And in fact, there's been a steady progress in how, for instance, European research area is trying to include countries in its immediate neighborhood. But that's because it makes sense and it's an organic product of relationships rather than any a result of any active policy. This brings me to the outline of the EU research program. So I might have come across as critical towards this idea of science diplomacy, but it's not all to say that policies shouldn't be there. Of course they are, and in fact, the EU research program, of which we are a huge beneficiary, has that very much, it's an element of the EU research program. There's so many things to say about the EU research program, and I really just wanted to say two things, which I think are important for the conversation we're having here. One is that, without going too much into detail about why there is EU in relation to member states, because it's a never-ending story and really difficult narrative to explain, the EU research program is a complementary and actually an add-on to the national research funds we have in our countries. And when we fund research within our national budgets, that is mostly, but not exclusively, to fund national research, really. And then the EU research program has to demonstrate what we call value added. And when value added from the perspective of the EU is precisely this international collaborations, mostly within EU member states, but also, as I said, with partner countries. And here the EU is merging a little bit also this foreign policy objective of bringing also neighboring countries. And so there are three pillars, what they call excellent science, which is really dedicated to excellence, and their excellence, like the ideas and the value of ideas, is sort of the only criterion. But then in pillar 2, which are global challenges and European industrial competitiveness, internationalization is almost an eligibility criterion. So in practical terms, when we present a proposal for a project, you cannot even apply for it unless you have 7 or 6 countries on board from different institutions and so on. And here you see that this is really, it's a policy push, it's a demand of the EU that we collaborate. And why we do this? Because it's producing, it's believed, and it also is demonstrated that it's producing more creative science. There's more circulation of ideas. And I think also for a reason of excluding certain biases that would be present in comparison to nationally composed groups and research groups. So this is to say that in the EU we are quite we're so forced to internationalize that we don't think of it other ways, because also most of researchers are also have had some experience with the EU research program, which is really also quite generous. These are compared to national funds, and I think here I'm speaking for the majority of member states, the EU funds are more lucrative. They're just better funds if you compare to national funds. They also bring you reputation, but it's also better money. Okay, so as I said, I would like to also present to you a little bit of what we do at Emuni. You will have heard often that we are both a university with a status of a university and a network. And these two, our two identities are impacting the way we do research. So in terms of themes, our mission is so broad that almost anything can come under the mission of cooperation in the region. But we have, in the last years, we have, I would say our stronger areas were related to sustainable development and blue economy, which is also an area that I am capable of supervising and generating new work, and creativity, entrepreneurship, and these values in teaching, where we have an important project vision. We also have different research projects that are related to different priorities. But what I want to show is that we both do research sort of in-house by those that are employed at Emuni, as well as we try to engage the network of Emuni universities to perform research because of this dual identity that I explained to you. In terms of funding, we are, as any institution, we have to be pragmatic. We basically are trying to get funds from wherever we can for the activities that we conduct, and this is all national funding, EU funding, and beyond EU funding, nothing. I mean, we are not going to kind of international competitive funds outside the EU. An important product of our activity, not only research, or in fact even less research than publication oriented, is our journal, International Journal of Euro-Mediterranean Studies, or EMS in short, which I would actually very much like to put on your map, yes, of both you as possible authors, and ask you to promote it to your colleagues, because now that you are so heavily engaged in Euro-Mediterranean cooperation, you can see that this title of the journal, this is really the scope where we try to focus, and we are a general journal that's open to any kind of contributions, interdisciplinary one, which welcomes publications without any publication charges, although it's open access. This is really Emuni's contribution also to open science since the journal was established. So we kind of preceded the trend of open science by this open access. All issues are available online, as well as in print. We print 200 copies. I would welcome you to take this one if you like it. We have past issues that we'll be happy to give out to you, but please promote it to possible authors, and in particularly for the occasion of your project meeting, and for the on the occasion, no, I didn't, it's a different version, and on the occasion of the Emuni conference, we have launched now a special thematic issue on the theme of internationalization in higher education, where we hope to get your contributions as well, your and your colleagues' contributions. This call will be disseminated to you. I was trying to have it published on our website, not our Emuni website where we're faster, but the journal's website where we still have issues with responsiveness because we have just transitioned online. But we will have it online shortly, and you will be the first target audience to disseminate it to. This call for a special issue, and I would really very warmly invite you to contribute to it. Now, I am not sure how much more time we have, how much more time you want to dedicate to this, but just in case we wanted to chat, there are some questions that we can take as either starting points of conversation, or we can leave it to you to think about them in your breaks or when you go home. Probably more likely because you're so overwhelmed and your program is quite packed here. But there's a lot of other things we can think about, for instance, just how to measure internationalization in research. And I wanted to have some kind of reflection on whether you do that and what kind of indicators you do, and how, of course, I would be interested in hearing how well your universities score and where they could do better. So that's just kind of a self-reflection that everyone can do. And we can also, we could be thinking about those more informal ways in which internationalization takes place. How going to coffee is oftentimes more important than what you do for a month. No, that's not, it was taken. I'm just saying that when you go to congresses, sometimes going for a coffee and meeting the right person is more important than what you do for months when you're trying to type that really brilliant idea, which turns out to not be all that brilliant. But there are a lot of things we could be talking about. And I understand that we're quite pressed for time, so I'll be just happy to chat maybe in break or over lunch or so on. Thank you.